Welcome to If Numbers Could Talk. Today is episode 48 of If Numbers Could Talk, titled Franchise Names and Numbers. Today's episode will be based on and giving you the information on the history of NBA teams from the very beginning when the NBA when it wasn't quite even yet the NBA yet, but the BAA in 1946 to the NBA in 1950 to current day. How many teams have there been in the NBA? How many teams did we start with, and how many teams do we currently have in the NBA? Those are the things we'll be talking about on today's episode of If Numbers Could Talk. And hey, you never really know. Maybe you'll find out that one of your teams that you like was around before you thought. Maybe they been around longer than history or the let's call it the friend groups, what the friend groups have discussed. And maybe you'll find out something that I thought was really interesting. Exactly when that big swing came, when did we really start to have a certain number of teams in the NBA? Again, welcome to If Numbers Could Talk, and that is what we'll be getting into. We'll really be diving, if you can say, into that today. So let's begin with the NBA from the beginning. The NBA started as the BAA. It was not called the NBA at the very beginning. In fact, the NBL, the National Basketball League, was already a league before the BAA and before the NBA was created. The BAA was around for 3 years by 1949-1950 season, and the NBL had been around for 12 years by the 1949-1950 season, which is when they merged to become the NBA. But all the way back at the beginning in 1946, when it was the BAA from 1946 to 1947, there were 11 teams in the NBA, and they played a total of 60 NBA games. The original 11 teams for the NBA were the Chicago Stags, the St. Louis Bombers, the Cleveland Rebels, the Detroit Falcons, Pittsburgh Ironmen, the Washington Capitals, the Philadelphia Warriors, the Providence Steamrollers, the New York Knicks, the Boston Celtics, and the Toronto Huskies. That's right. Only for the season of 1946 and 1947, there was a Toronto team. So from the very beginning of the BAA, the Toronto Huskies were a team. Toronto had a team from the very beginning in 1946. However, that team only lasted a year, and they played their games in the Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto. So in Toronto, Ontario. So what I figured from there, and I did a little research, and this is actually true. Basketball started as kind of a second income for a lot of already owned professional teams like hockey teams, right? Indoor sports teams. So at the time, I think it was majority hockey, but that is how the BAA originally started. The NBL again was already going. There were already basketball organizations being had and leagues being upheld, but it was the BAA that had the Toronto Huskies from 1946 to 1947. And that was the only season that the Toronto Huskies were around. Much later, we get to the Toronto Raptors, which we currently know today, but we'll get there. In 1947 to 1948, there were 8 teams in the NBA. 48 and 49, 12 teams in the NBA. In 1979, excuse me, 1979, excuse me. In 1949 and 1950, there were 17 teams in the NBA, and they played a total of 68 games for their season. So, just to add a few teams to that roster that we already knew about a little earlier, some of the names that were added to round us out to 17 teams, you had the Denver Nuggets, the Sheboygan Redskins, the Tri-City Blackhawks, the Waterloo Hawks, the Anderson Packers, Rochester Royals, Indianapolis Olympians, Minneapolis Lakers, the Baltimore Bullets, the Fort Wayne Pistons, and the Syracuse Nationals. These are all teams. Now, of course, some teams ended up changing names, and some of the original teams stuck around. But this was after a merger. So there were some teams that were just taken out. There were some teams that were brought in from the NBL. I want to say maybe only about 4 or 5 teams came over from the BAA, or it might have been the other way around. 4 or 5 teams came from the NBL. But they merged, and that's why you get a couple of different names. Some, I guess you could say, some reinvention of organizations, some changes of names. 1950 to 1951, there were 11 teams in the NBA. 1951 to 1953, there were 10 teams in the NBA. 1953 to 1955, there were 9 teams in the NBA. 1955 to 1961, there were 8 teams in the NBA. 61 to 66, there were 9 teams again in the NBA, and this is when we start to move upward. In 1966, 1967, there were 10 teams in the NBA. 67, 68, there were 12 teams in the NBA, and that is when we move up to 82 games per season. In 1968 and 1970, there were 14 teams in the NBA. 1970 to 1974, back to 17 teams when the merger happened. So now we're back even to when the merger happens. 1970 to 1974 season. By the 1974 season, there were 17 teams back in the NBA. 1974 to 1976, there were 18 teams by 1976. From 76 to 80, by 1980, there were 22 teams. We saw a nice little surge, 22 teams in the NBA, and we still played, as we do today, 82 games. So again, from 1967 all the way down to current, we played 82 games. However, it was a little later. Around I can't remember. 1984, I believe it was. Maybe 1986 is when we had our very first NBA lockout. And that is the only time you see shorter games aside from the most recent COVID pandemic. That was the only time you would see a shorter season other than 82 games, was because of a lockout of sorts, or lockouts have even happened because of CBA couldn't be agreed upon in time. So again, from 1967 on, we have 82 games. It was in 1980. By 1980, we had 22 teams and played 82 games. Teams that were added around 1976, 1977. The New Orleans Jazz, the San Antonio Spurs. I actually wrote the San Antonio Jazz, but they were the San Antonio Spurs from induction. So New Orleans Jazz, the San Antonio Spurs, the Indiana Pacers, the Denver Nuggets, and the New York Nets, who are currently known as the Brooklyn Nets. In 1980, from 1980 to 1988, by 1988, only one team had been added to have 23 teams. I want to say that team was the Dallas Mavericks. From 1988 to 89, by 1989, 2 more teams had been added to give us 25 total teams. 1989 and 1995, 2 more teams had been added to bring us to 27. 1995 to 2004, 2 more teams have been added to get us to 29. And around the end of 2020, around the end of 2004, 1 more team was finally added to give us the current total of 30 NBA teams. Some of the teams I have not named, but are as well NBA teams. To round us out, I've named a good portion of teams from the beginning, some of the name changes, some of the additions around 1976, 1977. The most recent additions, the final additions, were the Dallas Mavericks, the Miami Heat, the Charlotte Hornets, the Minnesota Timberwolves, the Toronto Raptors, Vancouver Grizzlies, which both came in at the same time, both Canadian teams. The Vancouver Grizzlies are no longer a team, but the Memphis Grizzlies are. And also, the last team to join the NBA was the Charlotte Bobcats. The Charlotte Bobcats. Now, interestingly enough, the Charlotte Hornets were a team beforehand, and the New Orleans Pelicans had been a team, or excuse me, were added in our team. So what ended up happening, I'm not really exactly sure on the history of this, honestly, but what I think is really interesting when you look at the Charlotte Bobcats and the Charlotte Hornets, I honestly don't know which one became the New Orleans Pelicans. And no, it was not the New Orleans Jazz. The New Orleans Jazz became the Utah Jazz when they moved to Utah. But I really don't remember which. I think it was the Charlotte Bobcats became the Charlotte Hornets, and the Charlotte Hornets became the New Orleans Pelicans. I want to say that's what happened. I'll have to do probably a whole nother episode to get that right for you guys, because unfortunately I did not do the full work on that. I am working off of memory on that one. However, currently we have 30 teams in the NBA. We began with only 11. At times, we were as low in the NBA as having 8 teams, even while playing 68 games. I don't even know how that works. I'm not even sure how that works. They still were playing 68 games with only 8 teams, or playing 60 games with only 8 teams. Playing 60 games with 11 teams, it's you played the same guys over and over and over. But you know what? If you really love this sport, I don't think you would complain too much, because they didn't get paid way back then like they get paid today. But it's for the love. Like literally, it was a hobby. They did this for fun, essentially. The things that they say were that you could not provide for a family on an NBA salary back in those days. However, in these days, you can not only take care of your family, but a few others, and really be a blessing to others if you choose to do that. Or you could just enjoy it on your own. And hey, who's to tell you what to do with what's yours? What I can say is the NBA, the BAA, the NBL, it's been clearly a very uh, lovable situation. Like people clearly like this situation. At a certain point, they found some way to find it lucrative, um, and they went from 8 to 9 to 10 to 12, so forth and so on, and got to 30. So enough people saw the light, enough people saw some interest, and they continued to come in and invest and build their own organization under the umbrella of the NBA. And here we are today with a very entertaining league, a very entertaining product that we consume regularly. I know people who say they don't like basketball, but if you ask them about certain players, they know more than they typically will divulge any other time. So, with this, I want to say thank you for hanging out. Thank you for tuning in to us this evening. This has been If Numbers Could Talk. The how many, excuse me, the franchise names and numbers. So you got the numbers as far as the amounts of teams and the amounts of games, and you got the names as far as what they started as and how they were added on over time to end up at 30 NBA teams. Thank you for coming through. We'll see you again next Tuesday for another episode of If Numbers Could Talk, episode 49, in fact. Head on over to YouTube, to Facebook, and check out some of our other podcasts. We have a lot of things out there for you. Plenty of content, various amounts of content, starting with the Exofathom on Mondays. Monday, you can catch Exofathom. They are on Facebook and YouTube. That comes on at 8 p.m. on Mondays for you. That is hosted by Nick, Ayla, and Mike. You can catch the Screen Time Continuum, which comes on Wednesdays and Thursdays. The Screen Time Continuum comes on for you around 8:30 on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and that is hosted by Nick, myself, and Dejan. You can also check out some video games and stuff over on Twitch. Dejan has a show over there called Strawberries and Coffee, where he plays some of the newer games, some of the older games, depending on how he's feeling and what it is that maybe somebody I mentioned or is really picking up steam. So if there's a game out that just come out and it's very interesting, and he has the space and he's not already covering something, you never know. He might cover that game that you're looking forward to. Check out DeJohn Strawberries and Coffee on Twitch Tuesdays and Thursdays at about 10 p.m. He also does a lot of impromptu shows. So make sure that you subscribe and follow to him, hit the bell so that you get notifications when he does go live. And that, I want to say, let's see, make sure I covered all of our shows, right? Screen Time Continuum, Exo Fathom, Strawberries and Coffee. Ah, that's right. If Numbers Could Talk. Again, you could come right back here to If Numbers Could Talk. We'll be here for you on Tuesdays. I appreciate you. Have a great one. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.